Ayana stood barefoot on the rain-soaked highway, her newborn screaming against her chest, while her husband's mistress crawled past in Ayana's own car, filming her, laughing. What none of them knew, not Xavier, not his mother, not the mistress, was that Ayana's signature controlled $88 billion. The rain had no mercy that night. It came down in sheets, thick and relentless, turning the highway shoulder into a river of mud and broken glass. And in the middle of all that chaos, walking barefoot with her hospital gown still damp against her skin, was Ayana, 28 years old, a woman who had just given birth 6 hours ago, a woman whose body was still trembling from labor, whose legs were shaking with every step, whose bare feet were being shredded by gravel and wet asphalt. And in her arms, pressed tight against her chest and wrapped in the only dry cloth she had left, her own shirt, was her newborn daughter Imani. The baby was screaming, not the soft cry of a child who wanted milk. This was the raw, terrified scream of a baby who could feel that something was deeply, terribly wrong. And Ayana kept walking, one foot in front of the other, because she had no other choice. 6 hours earlier, she had been lying in that hospital bed alone. No flowers on the nightstand, no balloons, no hand holding hers through the contractions, no one in the waiting room pacing the floor and checking the clock. She had pushed Imani into the world with nothing but her own strength, her own tears, and the voice of a nurse who kept saying, "You're doing great, sweetheart, just one more push." And when it was over, when that tiny girl was placed on her chest and Ayana felt the warmth of her daughter's skin against her own for the first time, she cried, not because of the pain, not because she was tired, because she already knew that no one was coming. She had called Xavier 3 times during labor. He hadn't answered once. She had texted Constance, his mother, asking her to please tell Xavier the baby was coming. Constance had read the message and never responded. After the delivery, when the nurses had cleaned Imani up and placed her in the bassinet beside the bed, Ayana picked up her phone one last time. She called Xavier, her husband, the man who had promised her forever at the altar 2 years ago with tears in his eyes, the man who had kissed her belly just 4 months into the pregnancy, laid his ear against her stomach and said, "I'm going to give our baby the world." He answered on the 3rd ring, and she could hear everything. She could hear music in the background, not quiet music, party music. She could hear glasses clinking, voices overlapping, laughter spilling through the speaker. She could hear his mother, Constance, cackling about something like she was having the night of her life. And then she heard a voice she recognized instantly, a voice that had haunted her for over a year. Yolanda, Xavier's mistress, the woman who had been circling their marriage like a vulture waiting for the last breath, the woman Xavier had sworn meant nothing. Ayana's throat tightened, but she spoke anyway. She kept her voice steady. She said, "Xavier, the baby is here. She's beautiful. I need you to come." And there was a pause, a long, empty, cruel pause. Then Xavier said 5 words that would echo in Ayana's mind for the rest of her life. "Walk home. You got legs." And Constance laughed in the background, a deep, satisfied laugh. And Yolanda said something Ayana couldn't quite make out, but the tone was enough. It was mockery. It was amusement. Ayana's pain was their entertainment for the evening. So she walked. She signed herself out of that hospital against medical advice. The nurse begged her to stay, told her she was still bleeding, told her the baby needed to be monitored for at least 24 hours. But Ayana signed the papers because she knew that staying in that hospital meant staying in the silence, and the silence would eat her alive. She wrapped Imani in a thin receiving blanket, the only one they had given her, tucked the baby against her chest, and stepped out into the rain. She had no money, no ride. Her phone was at 3%. and every step she took on that wet asphalt sent pain shooting up through her body because her feet were bare. She had come to the hospital in slippers, and someone had thrown them away during delivery. Nobody thought to save them. Nobody thought about Ayanna at all. She walked for almost 20 minutes before she heard a car slow down behind her. For one brief, foolish second, her heart jumped. She thought someone had come. She thought maybe Xavier had felt something, guilt, shame, anything human, and had changed his mind. But when she turned around, her stomach dropped, because she saw her own SUV, the silver Range Rover she had picked out herself at the dealership, the one she had saved for, the one Xavier had quietly transferred to Yolanda's use 3 months ago, while Ayanna was pregnant and too tired to fight about it. It rolled beside her with the window coming down, slow, deliberate, like a predator enjoying the chase. And behind the wheel was Yolanda, hair done in fresh curls, nails painted red, wearing a silk blouse Ayanna had never seen before, probably bought with money from the joint account. And Yolanda held up her phone, pointed it directly at Ayanna's face, and started recording. "Look at this," Yolanda said, her voice dripping with amusement. "This is what happens when you bore a king, walking in the rain like a stray dog." She tilted the camera down to get Ayanna's bare feet in the frame. Then she laughed, rolled the window up, and drove off. The tires hit a puddle and splashed muddy water across Ayanna's legs and across the blanket covering Imani. Ayanna didn't scream. She didn't curse. She didn't call after the car. She just adjusted the blanket around Imani's face to keep the mud out of her daughter's eyes, and she kept walking. Because the thing about Ayanna was this: she had been trained for pain, not by the world, not by heartbreak, by love, by a woman who had raised her in the quiet corners of Georgia and taught her that silence wasn't weakness. Silence was a loaded weapon, and the patient hand always wins. She made it home 45 minutes later, soaked through, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. Imani had stopped screaming by then and had fallen into a fitful, trembling sleep against her mother's bare chest. The baby's lips were slightly blue from the cold. Ayanna's feet were bleeding from 3 different cuts. She climbed the front steps and reached for the door, but Constance was standing there, arms folded across her chest, like a bouncer at a club that didn't want Ayanna inside. Xavier's mother had never liked Ayanna, not from the first introduction, not from the first dinner, not from the engagement. From the very first day they met, Constance had looked at Ayanna the way people look at temp workers, someone who would be gone soon enough, so why bother learning her name? And now, standing in that doorway with the porch light behind her, casting her shadow across Ayanna like a judgment, Constance looked down at the baby in Ayanna's arms and said, "That baby probably ain't even his. Lord knows what you were doing while my son was out working." Ayanna stared at her, said nothing. Constance stepped aside just enough to let her pass, but not before adding, "You can sleep in the basement. Yolanda's upstairs, in the real bedroom." Ayanna walked through the house she had helped furnish, past the couch she had picked out on a Sunday afternoon when she and Xavier were still happy, past the dining table where they had once shared meals and laughter and plans for the future, past the framed wedding photo on the hallway wall that nobody had bothered to take down yet because nobody cared enough to notice it, past the kitchen where she had cooked every Thanksgiving dinner, every Christmas spread, every birthday meal for 2 years. She walked down the basement stairs into the cold, unfinished space that smelled like concrete dust and old cardboard. There was no bed, no blanket, no pillow, just a folding chair and a stack of moving boxes from when they first bought the house. She lowered herself to the floor, slowly, painfully, because her body was screaming at her, and she leaned against the cinder block wall. She peeled off her soaking wet shirt and wrapped it around Imani the best she could. The baby stirred but didn't wake, and in that darkness, in that complete and suffocating silence, Ayana's phone buzzed one final time before the battery died. It was a notification from an app that no one in this house knew existed. No one on this street, no one in this city. A private banking portal protected by 3 layers of encryption, and the screen read, "Portfolio update, $88.2 billion, awaiting directive." Ayana glanced at it the way someone might glance at a clock they already know the time on. She closed the app. Around her neck, hidden beneath her wet gown, was a thin gold chain with a small iron key pendant. She wrapped her fingers around it, the cold metal warming slowly against her palm, and she whispered to Imani, "They don't know who raised me." To understand Ayana, you have to go back. You have to leave this basement, this house, this city, and travel back in time, past the Atlanta skyline and the highways and the noise, back to a small town in rural Georgia where the dirt roads didn't have names and the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive down a 2-lane highway. That's where Ayana grew up. Not in luxury, not in poverty, but in something far more valuable and far more rare. In dignity. She was raised by her grandmother, Odera, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with hands rough from decades of labor and eyes that could see through walls, through lies, through anyone's best performance. Odera didn't talk much. Whole days would pass with only a handful of sentences between them. But when Odera spoke, every word landed like a nail being driven into hardwood. She used to tell young Ayana, "The loudest person in the room owns nothing. The silent one owns the room." And Ayana carried that sentence her whole life, without ever realizing she was carrying a blueprint. What no one in that small town knew, not the pastor, not the neighbors, not the mailman who had been delivering to that house for 20 years, was that Odera was the anonymous founder of one of the largest rare earth mineral and mining companies on the planet. Odera Global Holdings, a name that appeared in SEC filings, international trade agreements, and Fortune magazine's annual power list, but never once in a newspaper next to a photograph. Odera had built that empire quietly, brick by invisible brick, over 40 years. It started with a single mineral deposit discovered on land her great-grandfather had been given during Reconstruction, land that people assumed was worthless scrub and clay. But Odera saw something no one else did. She hired geologists on her own. She licensed the extraction rights through a series of holding companies. She reinvested every single dollar, and she never told a soul. She wore the same floral house dresses until the patterns faded. She drove the same rusted pickup truck until the muffler dragged on the ground. And every single day, without fail, she wore a thin gold chain with a small iron key pendant, the key to the original deed box where the first mineral survey and the founding documents were kept. When Odera passed away, Ayana was 22 years old. The funeral was small. Just a pastor, a handful of neighbors who brought casseroles, and a choir of 3 women who sang "Precious Lord" so softly it sounded like the wind was carrying the melody. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, a man named Solomon arrived at the house. He was Odera's attorney, the only person alive who knew the full scope of what Odera had built. He sat Ayana down at the kitchen table, the same table where Odera had taught her to read, to count money, to write thank-you notes. And he told her everything: the company, the holdings, the trust, the offshore accounts, the mineral rights spanning 4 countries, the board of directors who had been operating for years under the instruction of an anonymous chairwoman, and the fact that as of that morning, Ayana was the sole owner and chairwoman of an $88 billion empire. Ayana sat there for a very long time. She didn't cry. She didn't celebrate. She didn't ask a single question about the money. She asked only one question. Did she live the way she wanted? Solomon nodded, and Ayanna said, "Then I don't want anyone to know." Solomon understood, because he had known Odera for 30 years, and he could see the old woman sitting in the young one's eyes. Ayanna moved to Atlanta and buried the truth so deep even GPS couldn't find it. She lived in a modest apartment. She took a job at a nonprofit because she wanted to help people, not because she needed the paycheck. And that's where she met Xavier. He was magnetic, ambitious, the kind of man who walked into a room and the air rearranged itself around him. A mid-level real estate developer with dreams the size of skyscrapers and a smile that could sell sand to a beach. He pursued Ayanna with an intensity that made her feel seen for the first time since Odera died. He took her to dinner and actually listened. He remembered the small things. He told her he was going to build an empire and he wanted her beside him when he did. And Ayanna believed him. Not because she was foolish, not because she was naive, but because she wanted more than anything in this world to be loved for who she was, not for what she owned. So she married him within a year, and she never told him about the billions. She thought love was supposed to be the only currency that mattered. On the last night of Odera's life, the old woman had taken the iron key pendant from around her own neck, the same pendant she had worn every day for 40 years, and placed it around Ayanna's. She held Ayanna's face in both hands, looked her dead in the eyes, and said, "When they push you to the floor, this key opens the door they didn't know existed." Ayanna cried that night. She didn't understand the weight of those words yet. But 6 years later, sitting on a basement floor, holding a newborn in the dark, she understood perfectly. The weeks that followed were the cruelest season of Ayanna's life. Not because of the pain itself. She had built a relationship with pain a long time ago. But because of the precision of it, the surgical nature, the way Xavier and Constance and Yolanda dismantled her dignity, one calculated piece at a time, like they were conducting an experiment to find out how much a human being can absorb before they stop being human. It started with the closet. One Tuesday morning, Ayanna came upstairs from the basement to find her clothes stuffed into black trash bags by the back door, all of them, her dresses, her work blouses, her jeans, even Imani's baby clothes that she had folded neatly the night before. Yolanda had officially moved into the master bedroom closet. Constance had supervised the entire operation, folding Ayanna's things with the kind of detached efficiency you give to goodwill donations, not out of respect, but out of habit. When Ayanna stood in the bedroom doorway and asked what was happening, Constance didn't even look up. She just said, "You brought nothing to this family. Be thankful you still have a roof over your head." Then came the financial strangulation. Xavier called the bank on a Wednesday afternoon and canceled Ayanna's debit card on their joint account. No warning, no discussion, just a phone call and a keystroke, and overnight, Ayanna went from having access to basic necessities, groceries, diapers, formula, to having absolutely nothing. She had to stand in front of Xavier and ask for money to buy diapers for their daughter. He peeled off a few bills, handed them to her without looking up from his phone, and said, "That should cover it, be grateful." It was half of what she needed. Yolanda watched the entire exchange from the kitchen island, leaning back on her elbows, sipping coffee from Ayanna's favorite mug, the blue ceramic one with the chipped handle that Odera had given her years ago. Yolanda didn't know what that mug meant. She didn't know it had crossed state lines in a cardboard box packed with newspaper. She just liked the color. But the worst came on a Saturday afternoon at the family cookout. Xavier's extended family had gathered in the backyard. Aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbors. Maybe 30 people, all eating, talking, laughing in the summer heat. Constance had organized the whole thing like it was a coronation. She stood in the middle of the yard, cleared her throat, and made an announcement. She introduced Yolanda as Xavier's real partner. She called her my true daughter-in-law. She told the crowd with a pride so thick you could taste it that Xavier had finally found a woman who matched his ambition and his vision. Meanwhile, Ayanna was inside the kitchen, not as a guest, as the help. She had been told to prepare food and bring it out. She carried plates of ribs and baked beans and cornbread to the tables. She refilled coolers with ice. She wiped down chairs. And no one stopped her. No one said, "Sit down, baby, you just had a baby 3 weeks ago." No one said, "Let someone else carry that." They watched her work and said nothing, because Constance had told them all who mattered and who didn't. And then it happened. Ayanna was carrying a heavy platter across the patio when her hands, still weak from the delivery, still recovering from weeks of inadequate food and sleep, gave out. The plate hit the concrete and shattered. Potato salad and broken ceramic everywhere. The yard went quiet for half a second, and then Yolanda's voice cut through the silence like a razor. "Can't even hold a dish," she said, loud enough for all 30 guests to hear. "How you gonna hold a man?" And the yard exploded with laughter, from Xavier's cousins, from his aunts, from people who had eaten Ayanna's cooking at every holiday for 2 years and never once said thank you. They laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. And Ayanna knelt on the ground, picking up shards of broken plate and sliced her finger on a jagged edge. Blood dripped onto the patio concrete, red on gray. No one noticed. No one paused their laughter. No one handed her a napkin. That night, down in the basement, Ayanna held Imani against her chest and cried without making a sound. She had perfected the art of silent crying, a skill no human being should ever have to master. Her phone buzzed in the darkness. It was Solomon. She stared at the screen glowing in the pitch-black room, watching his name pulse. She let it ring. He left a voicemail. She pressed the phone to her ear and listened on the lowest volume. "Ayanna, the board is getting restless. They've been patient, but they can't hold quarterly decisions much longer without your directive. You need to step in. Please, call me back." She deleted the voicemail. She held the iron key pendant against her lips, feeling the cold metal warm against her mouth, and she whispered 2 words into the darkness. Not yet. 2 months after Imani was born, Xavier sat Ayanna down at the kitchen table. It wasn't a conversation, it was an ambush. Yolanda stood behind his right shoulder like a shadow with lipstick. Constance sat at the counter pretending to read a magazine, but hanging on every syllable. Xavier slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were divorce papers, thick, professional, prepared by an expensive attorney. He told Ayanna in a voice so rehearsed it sounded like a script that he was filing for full custody of Imani. His grounds: Ayanna was unemployed, had no verifiable income, had no stable housing of her own, and was, in his carefully chosen words, mentally and emotionally unfit to raise a child. He delivered it like a closing argument, like Yolanda and Constance had coached him on every word, every pause, every inflection, and behind him Yolanda smirked, not a small smirk, a full, satisfied, mission-accomplished smirk. The smirk of a woman who believed the war was already over. Ayanna looked at the papers. She looked at Xavier, at the face she had once loved so deeply it hurt. She looked past him at Yolanda, at the smirk, at the red nails, at the silk robe that used to be hers. She looked at Constance, who hadn't turned a page in 5 minutes, and then she looked down at the iron key pendant resting against her chest. She said one word, "Okay." That was all. No tears, no argument, no pleading, no anger, just okay. And she stood up, pushed her chair in, and walked back down to the basement. Xavier and Yolanda exchanged a look. Constance flipped a page. They all thought they had won. They thought that okay was the white flag. They thought the war was over, but they were wrong about everything. That okay was not the sound of a woman giving up. It was the sound of a woman who had just decided she was done being merciful. The next morning, while Xavier was at his office, preparing for the biggest deal of his career, and Yolanda was at the nail salon spending money from the joint account, Ayana made a phone call, not from her regular phone, from a second device she had kept hidden in the lining of Imani's diaper bag since the day she left the hospital, a phone Solomon had sent her weeks ago just in case. She dialed his number. He answered on the first ring, like he had been holding the phone in his hand for months, and for the first time in 6 years, Ayana said the words he had been waiting to hear. "I'm ready." Solomon exhaled, and then he said, "Tell me everything." 3 weeks later, Xavier's real estate company was hosting the most important night of his career, a black tie fundraiser gala at one of Atlanta's most prestigious venues. Crystal chandeliers, 200 guests in designer suits and evening gowns, investors from New York, Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles, media cameras near the entrance. This was the night Xavier was going to pitch his crown jewel, a $200 million luxury development project that would put his name on the Atlanta skyline forever. He had spent months preparing new tailored suits, new business cards on thick linen stock, a new Rolex that Yolanda had picked out for him with money from the joint account. Yolanda herself was on his arm in a beaded gown that cost more than most people's annual rent. Constance was stationed near the entrance like a general, overseeing the battlefield, greeting guests with the warmth of someone who believed she belonged among them. Everything was orchestrated, everything was polished, and Ayana had been told, in no uncertain terms, to stay home with the baby and not embarrass anyone. But Ayana didn't stay home. At exactly 8:15, the ballroom doors opened, and every single head in that room turned. Ayana walked in like the room had been built for her arrival, a floor-length black gown cut with surgical precision, moving like water with every step, her hair pulled back from her face, clean and elegant, no diamonds, no flash, just one piece of jewelry, the iron key pendant gleaming against her collarbone like it had been waiting its whole existence for this moment. Behind her walked Solomon, silver-haired and composed, carrying a leather briefcase, and behind him, a nanny in a quiet gray dress, holding Imani, who was dressed in white lace and sleeping peacefully. The room didn't go quiet. It held its breath, because Ayana didn't look like the woman Xavier had described to his friends. She didn't look broken. She didn't look beaten. She didn't look like someone who slept in a basement. She looked like power that had been holding its tongue. Xavier saw her from across the room. His champagne glass stopped halfway to his lips. His face moved through 5 emotions in 3 seconds. Confusion, irritation, embarrassment, fear, and then something he couldn't name, something that felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet. Yolanda grabbed his arm and hissed, "What is she doing here?" Constance stopped mid-sentence and stared, her smile frozen on her face like a mask that had cracked. But Ayana didn't look at any of them. She walked past the round tables and the champagne towers and the confused whispers, straight to the stage. The event host, a smooth-voiced man in a tuxedo, was mid-sentence when a staff member handed him a card. He read it. His eyes went wide. He cleared his throat, adjusted his microphone, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed that we have a very special guest joining us this evening. Please welcome the anonymous owner and chairwoman of Odera Global Holdings, valued at $88 billion, Ayana." The room didn't gasp. It froze. 200 people in their finest clothes stood in absolute cathedral silence. Xavier's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Yolanda's grip on his arm went completely slack. Constance lowered herself into a chair without being invited to sit, like her legs had simply refused to hold her anymore. Ayanna stepped to the podium. She didn't rush. She didn't grip the edges for support. She placed her hands flat on the surface, looked out at the room, and spoke the way Odera had taught her. Low, clear, and absolutely devastating. She said, "Most of you know my husband Xavier. He's here tonight to ask you to invest $200 million in a luxury development project, a project he describes as being built on prime real estate." She paused. Let the silence do its work. "That land belongs to me. It has belonged to my family for over 100 years. It was my grandmother's land. It was deeded to my great-great-grandfather during Reconstruction, and no one, not Xavier, not his company, not his attorneys, ever had permission to develop it. The deal you're being asked to fund tonight is built on land that was never his to sell. The deal is dead." A murmur rolled through the room like thunder. Investors looked at each other. Xavier opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His lips moved, but there was no sound, like a man drowning in air. Ayanna continued. She said, "But that's not why I'm here tonight." She nodded to Solomon, who pressed play on a small device connected to the venue's speaker system. And the room heard a recording, crystal clear. Xavier's voice, relaxed and confident. Yolanda's voice, playful and conspiratorial. Xavier saying, "Once I get full custody, her child support payments alone will cover the mortgage. And with her out of the picture, the house is mine." Yolanda laughing, responding, "She won't even fight it. She's too weak. She's too broken. She'll just take whatever we give her and disappear." The recording played for 45 seconds. It felt like 45 years. When it ended, the silence in that ballroom was so heavy it had its own gravity. Ayanna spoke one final time. She said, "There's one more thing." She held up a printed document, a forensic audit prepared by Solomon's team over the past 3 weeks. This audit shows that Xavier has embezzled $1.4 million from his own company over the past 18 months, taken directly from the investment funds that his partners and clients trusted him with. The people he stole from are sitting in this room right now. She laid the document on the podium the way a judge lays down a verdict. Xavier lurched forward 2 steps and croaked, "Ayanna, wait, let me explain." But his voice broke like a man who had just realized. The building he was standing in had no foundation. Constance grabbed his arm, whispering something frantic and desperate. And Yolanda, the woman who had filmed Ayanna walking barefoot in the rain, the woman who had laughed from behind the wheel, the woman who had called her a stray, Yolanda took 3 quiet steps backward and disappeared into the crowd like smoke. No goodbye. No explanation. She simply read the room the way a rat reads a sinking ship, and she chose the exit. Ayanna leaned into the microphone one final time. Her voice was steady, her eyes were dry. She said, "I walked barefoot in the rain with my baby girl against my chest because I wanted to believe that my husband was more than his greed. He wasn't, but I am more than his cruelty, and my daughter will never sleep on a concrete floor again." Then she reached up, unclasped the iron key pendant from around her neck, and placed it gently on the podium. She placed it the way you place something holy on an altar, with reverence, with finality, with goodbye. She turned. She took Imani from the nanny's arms, and she walked out of that ballroom. She did not look at Xavier. She did not look at Constance. She did not look at anyone. The only sound was the click of her heels on the marble, and then the doors closed behind her, and the room stayed silent for a very long time. What happened next? Didn't take long. Karma, when it finally arrives, doesn't send a warning. It doesn't knock politely. It kicks the door off the hinges and sits down at your table. Xavier's investors pulled out within 48 hours. Every single one. Phone calls were made, Lawyers were summoned. The forensic audit was forwarded to accountants, regulatory agencies, and the district attorney's office. Within 2 weeks, Xavier's company didn't decline. It collapsed. The office was padlocked. The staff was terminated. His bank accounts, business and personal, were frozen pending a criminal investigation. Embezzlement charges were formally filed on a Thursday morning. Xavier called Ayana 19 times from 19 different phone numbers. Over the course of 1 week, she never answered, not once, not because she was being petty, not because she wanted revenge, because she had nothing left to say to a man who had asked his pregnant wife to walk home in the rain. Yolanda's ending was almost poetic in its precision. The instant Xavier's world crumbled, she evaporated. She didn't pack slowly. She didn't have a tearful goodbye. She moved through that house like a woman who had always known this day would come and had rehearsed her exit 100 times. She grabbed her bags, her jewelry, her designer shoes, and whatever cash she could find in the drawers. But she made one fatal mistake on her way out the door. She took the silver Range Rover, the same SUV she had used to follow Ayana on that rain-soaked highway, the same car she had driven past a barefoot mother and her screaming newborn while laughing into a camera and calling her a stray. That vehicle had always been registered in Ayana's name. Always. From the day it was purchased. Solomon reported it as unauthorized possession within 6 hours of Yolanda driving away. 2 days later, Yolanda was pulled over on Interstate 85 by 2 state troopers with their lights flashing. She was arrested on the shoulder of the highway, in broad daylight, on camera, in full view of passing traffic. Mascara running in black streaks down her face, hands trembling so badly she couldn't hold her license, screaming at the officers that she didn't know it wasn't hers, that Xavier had given it to her, that this was all a misunderstanding. But the officers weren't interested in her explanations. They weren't interested in what she didn't know. They were interested in the warrant. And as they placed her in the back of the patrol car on the same kind of rain-soaked highway where she had once filmed a barefoot woman carrying a baby, the irony was so thick you could choke on it. And then there was Constance, Xavier's mother, the woman who had blocked the front door, the woman who had called baby Imani illegitimate to her mother's face, the woman who had introduced Yolanda as her real daughter-in-law, while Ayana served plates at the cookout. When everything fell apart, Constance called Ayana's phone 7 times in a single day, each voicemail more desperate than the last. She used words she had never used before, words like family and forgiveness and we need to stick together, words that had never crossed her lips when Ayana was sleeping on concrete. Solomon responded on Ayana's behalf with a cease and desist letter, so cold it could have frosted glass. And then the final blow landed. The house Constance had been living in, the house she had treated as her throne room, the house where she had blocked the door and banished Ayana to the basement, had been purchased through a subsidiary of Odera Global Holdings. It had always been Ayana's property. Constance received an eviction notice on a Tuesday morning. She was out by Friday afternoon, loading boxes into a borrowed car in the same driveway where Ayana had once arrived soaking wet with a newborn in her arms. Xavier's final scene was the quietest one in this entire story. He sat in a bare 1-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of town. No art on the walls, no food in the fridge, no voice in the hallway. Takeout containers stacked on the counter next to a sink full of dishes he couldn't bring himself to wash. The signed divorce papers sat on the kitchen table, the ink still dark, the pages still crisp, like even the paper knew the weight of what had been decided. Custody of Imani had been awarded to Ayana without a single moment of contest. The audio recording and the embezzlement charges and the forensic audit had made sure of that. No judge on earth was going to hand a child to a man who had laughed about using his own daughter as a paycheck. Xavier sat on a folding chair, the same kind of cheap, cold, uncomfortable folding chair Ayana had sat on in the basement, while he slept upstairs with another woman, and he stared at the television. A news segment was playing. The anchor's voice was warm and admiring as she told the story of a woman known as the Barefoot billionaire, a story that had gone viral across every platform, every country, every language. The headline on the screen read, "The Barefoot Billionaire, How One Woman's Silence Became Her Greatest Power." Xavier stared at the screen until the colors blurred and the words lost their shape. He thought about the rain. He thought about the phone call. He thought about the 5 words he had said that started everything. Walk home. You got legs. And for the first time, he understood what he had thrown away. Not just a wife, not just a mother, but the kind of woman the entire world was now standing up to applaud. He put his head in his hands. The apartment was silent. His phone didn't ring. Nobody knocked on the door. Nobody was coming. Nobody was ever going to come again. Ayana moved to the coast of Georgia, not to a penthouse, not to a gated compound with security and staff, to a quiet estate shaded by live oaks, where the salt air came through the windows in the morning and the sound of the ocean was the last thing you heard before sleep. It was less than 10 miles from the land where Odera had raised her, close enough to feel the old woman's presence in the soil. She built a foundation in Odera's name, a foundation for single mothers who had been told they were nothing, for children who had been born into homes that treated them like inconveniences. She funded shelters, legal aid clinics, mental health counseling, education grants, job training programs. She did all of it quietly, the way Odera would have done it, with open hands and a closed mouth. Because Ayana had learned something most people never learn. The deepest power doesn't announce itself. It just arrives when the people who need it have nowhere else to turn. One evening, when the sun was painting the Georgia sky in shades of amber and rose, Ayana walked into Imani's nursery. The baby was sleeping on her back, one tiny fist curled around the edge of her blanket, her breathing soft and steady and perfect. Ayana opened a small velvet box she had been carrying and took out the iron key pendant, the same pendant Odera had worn every day for 40 years, the same one Ayana had placed on the podium the night she changed everything. Solomon had retrieved it for her the next morning. She placed it inside a glass display case on the shelf above Imani's crib. She knelt beside her daughter, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath, and she whispered, "One day, baby girl, I'm going to tell you about the woman who gave me this, about your great-grandmother, about the fields she walked and the empire she built with her bare hands. And you're going to understand why your mama walked barefoot in the rain, carrying you against her chest, not because she had nothing, but because she needed to know who would love her when she had nothing. And the answer, Imani, was you. It was always you." She touched the glass case one last time, her fingertips resting on the surface above the pendant. Then she stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the land. Odera's land, the same fields the old woman had walked every morning, the same red Georgia clay that held the minerals that built a silent empire. The sun was going down, and the light was doing that thing it only does in Georgia, turning everything golden, turning everything soft, turning everything into a painting you want to step inside of and never leave. And Ayana smiled, not a big smile, not a victory smile, a quiet one, the kind of smile that only comes after you've survived something that was designed to destroy you, and you came out the other side without becoming the thing that tried to break you, the kind of smile Odera would have been proud of. Some people will only see your worth when the world tells them to, but the ones who saw you in the rain, those are the ones who deserve your sunshine. If this story made you feel something you can't explain, if it reminded you of someone who endured in silence and never got the credit, or if it reminded you of yourself, then do one thing for me. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it tonight. because this channel isn't just stories. It's proof that the quiet ones always rise. And they rise higher than anyone expected. I'll see you in the next one.